Like you have the angels, and then you have your VC investments, right? And in between there, I call it the 600K gap. Sometimes the market is so obvious that it's enough for you to have a good idea, and then you can develop it and the market will accept it. But sometimes you also just need to go to the market with a shitty idea and then have them tell you how bad it is and show you what you should be doing instead. So a lot of the news that you always hear is on the amounts of funding raised. That is equivalent to success. But to me, a very successful company is one that doesn't need to raise much money and still managing to grow.
Excited to have you here, Moritz. We go way back, but we never really did one of these. And I think the experience that you had over the past year is super interesting for our listeners, and just a super interesting story to share. So yeah, excited about today's episode.
Very happy to be here. Yeah, it's I think it's been like 7 years or 8 years since I left Equidem when I was still working together with you, and since then sort of dived a little bit deeper into the startup world in the Netherlands and Switzerland now, and yeah, really enjoying it.
Yeah, nice. Now you're working with one of these cutting edge deep tech startups on geothermal energy and drones borrowing tunnels for geothermal energy, which sounds like extremely sci-fi. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what the company does, just to paint that picture for the rest of the discussion. And we'll talk more about like fundraising and that side.
For sure. So we are not super far advanced in terms of sort of the usual scale of startups, I guess, in the progress towards the market. We're still in the development stage in our company. We're currently a team of 15, so we're not very small either yet, but sort of very much at the time where we're developing prototypes, testing those prototypes and trying to improve them over time. So you said it already, we're developing hardware. It's something, I guess, very specific, very niche. You work with a lot of steel for the most part. So we're developing a drill that can drill to about 250 meters down, and then allows you to install a heat probe where you can heat and cool your building afterwards. And essentially what we're trying to do is make this very small, very cost efficient, and thus very accessible, so that you can bring sustainable heating to many, many households in the next couple of years. And so this is a spin-off from a university here in Zurich. And where for the most part, it's all mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and mechanics working here. And then there's me. I'm handling pretty much everything else that is there. So we can talk about fundraising, of course. We can talk about public funding. We can talk about running a team, trying to grow a team, of course, as well. Doing a little bit of the software side of things here as well for the drill, because you somehow need to control the drill, of course, at the beginning. Still, it's supposed to be autonomous at some point in the future. But for now, of course, somehow you need to manage it and run it and see that that things are working, that you can read out the different values of the sensors inside the drill and so on. So yeah, it's exciting times at the moment, and it's an interesting market because sort of heating is something that concerns us all to a certain extent. We all got to heat our houses or cool them potentially in the future as well. And it's a market that's very much so it's funny when you talk to other people, you don't ever even have to describe the market size to anybody, because everybody understands from the get-go that heating is quite important for us all.
Yeah.
So it's, from a startup perspective, it's a bit weird in terms of like the selling to investors, because you are essentially, all you have to do is sell your business model and your product. The market itself is quite understandable.
Especially now with the rising cost of energy, rising cost of heating, right? And the constraints on energy supply that we're likely going to see because of the like AI side and everything. So right now it's very much at the center of a wave.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, that definitely plays into it. Gas and diesel and oil, they're all becoming more expensive, becoming increasingly more difficult to get your hands on. At the same time, these systems are getting better and they're getting cheaper as well. And that sort of brings them more into the market, especially like air source heat pumps have had quite a push in sort of the 2023s and 2022s in Germany. Then there was a little bit of a dip afterwards, but that was more of a supply side issue. And now they're sort of gaining traction again. But there's also other parts in the world where things are very different still. So we're in contact with drilling companies all over the world. And in Canada, for example, you still have certain areas where gas is so cheap that nobody has seen a heat pump before.
I think it's a super interesting stage, right? That you're at, because you have, a lot of companies at that stage, and not many people talk about the specific challenges, especially hardware companies these days, right? We've been used to software over the past 10 years being like sort of the traditional model, and then so much literature, so much research has been done for that specific model, investment funds like geared towards that, returns and everything like kind of shaped around that. And now that model doesn't work anymore. Nobody's investing in software anymore unless you're like super heavy into AI or something like that. And then all these hardware companies are all of a sudden super interesting. And it's, okay, what's the model there, right? How do we finance it? How long does it take to see returns? How do we think about technology readiness and so on, right? Really much under the spotlights.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Can you like share what was your fundraising journey so far? Like, I know you guys raised a big round early last year. Yeah. How did that go?
Yeah. Maybe one point to that, to investors getting more interested in hardware. We're definitely seeing that as well. I think there is an increasing amount of investors also interested in geothermal in general. So that's starting to see a little bit of a spike, because people are seeing that there is quite a lot of potential, and a lot of things have changed in this market over the last couple of years. So that's cool. I think investors need to have an understanding of what the payback periods look like in hardware startups, and also what the go-to-market looks like, because we're not pushing out a software and then the next day we can run Google Ads and have 1 million users on it. We need to essentially work with our customers very closely and learn from them. We are developing a product that is supposed to work in geologies, right, in different types of geologies, and so you're working with very natural products and you're creating an unnatural product to work with that. And so it's very difficult to get that to be reliable. And so your go to market looks very different. It looks like you're testing with customers, you're learning from customers. And then once you've gotten to a certain level of reliability, then you can scale up and then you can bring that production up, and then you're creating assets that are of value. And I think that is something that in the end is also, or can be, very interesting to investors, again, that see a little bit more of a long-term perspective of things. From our side of point of view, like the journey that we've gone through in terms of fundraising started in 2023. We had this was a university project back then, and we were able to gather just a tiny little bit of public interest. We're in the local newspaper. And that local newspaper, tiny, nobody knows it outside of Winterthur, allowed us to find our first angel investors. So we had some angel investors that said, hey, love this technology. This is super cool. I would love to have a ground-source heat pump in my garden as well, but I don't have the space for it. And these are just private people, right? They're not professional angel investors. They invested in us and nobody else. So these were able to get us sort of off the ground. It also allowed us to get some interest from drilling companies as well. And we had our first drilling company invest in us as well. So the largest Swiss drilling company invested in us, which was very useful, of course, because we got to have an early understanding of how a drilling company works from sort of like a cost perspective and how they manage their operations, but also they can help us in our own drilling adventures, right? The ground is different everywhere. So it helps to have that experience. Then sort of just moved along a little bit, sort of on the equity investment side, of course. We then had some others join the picture. The property development company that was interested in investing joined. And then there is a couple different sort of avenues that you can go down. And I guess that is a bit Switzerland specific. But there's funding programs that can really help you get off the ground. So the local state authority is called InnoSwiss, and InnoSwiss can help you in a variety of different ways. So they can help you with very small grants. They can help you when you're working together with universities, but they can also help you with very large grants to a certain extent. And you can sort of go through that as you progress through your stages. And so there's different smaller ideation projects that you can do with them, where they can support you with up to 20K, for example, that can really kickstart a little bit something. You can start buying some parts for your drills and so on. So that's a very good way of setting off. And then on the other hand, there is something called Venture Kick in Switzerland. And Venture Kick is more or less a startup competition, but it's not like there's one winner. They have rounds that go on through the entire year, and you can apply for it, and it goes in 3 stages. And so the first stage is if you're always going to be pitching against a couple of other startups in each round. In the first round, if you get that, then you are supported with essentially 10K as free money. There's no obligation other than that you apply for the second round and take part in that as well. In the second round, you get 40K. At that point, it all becomes a loan, a convertible loan. And then you can apply for the third round, and that is 100K. So you sort of get 150K to kickstart things. And that gets you relatively known in Switzerland in the startup scene as well. I mean, it's a bit like potentially the Netherlands as well. You have a couple of different sort of organizations that really dominate the funding for a really early stage. And if you're in those circles, it's not difficult to get in, then people know you, and then you can really start from there. And so
Yeah.
from there on, we really were able to develop the funding a bit further and get closer towards also VC funding. I mean, we got the best introduction for VC funding from you yourself
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
Underground
One
Ventures,
that paid
who
off.
are
Yeah.
investing in. Yeah, exactly. And the one that's still paying off for us very, very well, because Underground Ventures is an investor that is not just typical VC. They are so very much focused on the market of geothermal that they are worldwide, everywhere, in every single bit of geothermal conferences or events. They're always there. And that means that they're really, really well connected. They're also teaching other venture capital firms on geothermal. So they're helping them invest in this market, and they're taking us along for the journey. And that is very, very important for us in the end as well, because we get a lot of contacts through that as well. So it's not just the one-time part of getting the money. The money, of course, is important to pay the bills and to pay the wages, but it's sort of there for the first time I could really feel the impact that somebody that is well connected in a very niche industry can have on your business.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for sure. So Switzerland is doing a lot, right? So countries can do a lot, but I think specifically Switzerland is really, over the past 5 or 6 years, had a fantastic setup of systems to help early stage companies and early stage startups. I think other countries are doing probably less. I think, France was doing a lot, and now maybe it's a little bit less. But this type of systems and this type of centripetal forces, putting your company at the center of a system, of a niche of investors, can be very, very helpful. And yeah, it's great to know about investors adding value on top of money, right? There is a lot of debate over whether that's even possible, whether it's true on average. I think it's probably true that on average that's not true, right? But then the best investors definitely add value. And especially these days where getting exposure and getting specific industry knowledge is in my opinion, becoming harder and harder because of like AI slop and like difficulty of getting to the end customer. Then the connections that
Yeah.
can come warmly from an investor are extremely helpful.
That is, I mean, it's one of those things, like whenever you talk to a VC, it is what you are being promised, right? You're being promised money and you're being promised connections. But as you say, I'm not sure whether that always holds true. And in this case, it really does, because we just have somebody that is so focused on this area that they are spreading the word like crazy, and people are becoming increasingly more interested in the topic. And I think in Switzerland in general, they just noticed at some point that that a lot of IP was being created in Switzerland, and that IP was then moved to the US because companies would be founded in the US with Swiss IP. And yeah, that's a bit of a shame, right? We want to keep the startups ideally here.
Yeah.
And so I think that the Swiss government really started investing heavily in these sort of funding programs out there that can support you very much in the early stages, and then also move along a little bit as you grow.
And so now you have pretty much already every class of investor, right? You have angel investors, you have public investors, you have venture capitalists, roughly, right? So do you feel like, well, you're getting different value from each of them, right? Which is, I think very strategic. Is there like a positive of having the whole mix, or Would it be better to have like a dominant sort of category of investors, or do you just see value in the whole,
So for us, I see quite a lot of value in having a mix. So in the very early stages, I think getting around angel investors is very difficult and maybe also not desirable. Maybe you want to have those angel investors also in the beginning because they are the first ones that can show you whether there's interest for your product, right? If somebody is that interested in your product that they are willing to invest, then that is a good sign. They're not going to be helping you much along the way in terms of giving you connections or follow-up funding because they are not able to. That's also not the point, right? They're trying to get you started, and that is sort of the interesting bit there. And then for us, I think we are potentially also a bit lucky in that we were able to build our network of investors up in a way that they're all providing us with quite a bit of value. So we have sort of people in all the different areas that we think is valuable to us or will be valuable to us in the future. And so for us, of course, having the industry invest in us is on one hand ideal because we get to understand how they function, how they work, how their brains work. On the other hand, it is also them showing trust, right? It's a customer that is showing you the ultimate trust in investing in you. So that is something that is also strong again for other investors that might be joining. And it's a strong sign to other customers in the end that there's customers out there that really believe in this product and that want to be amongst the first to get it. So I think there's a lot of value in that. In with property development companies, there's a lot of value in the future with how you can get to market. And then with strategic investors, there's of course the value in the amount of sums that they can put into a startup is beyond what a smaller strategic or angel could do, and the doors they can open you up more on a worldwide scale. The ones that we have in terms of strategy, they're very much Switzerland based, and that helps us very much in our sort of starting market here. But then if we want to go beyond that, then that is really something where VCs can be really good because in the end, they're all talking to each other, right? They all know each other to a certain extent. There's events where they go to. And if somebody really believes in your product, then they can really be a great advocate for you and push out the word.
Yeah. Was it like a deliberate sort of search for this type of investors? Maybe like can you walk us through like how did you prepare the round? How did you go after it and how it went?
So yeah, for us it was a mix out of CLAs and equity in the end. So we had most of our strategics we had in through CLAs already, essentially when we shortly after we started the company. So we had been in contact with them already beforehand, and they were sort of the seed funding or the pre-seed, whatever you want to call it, that we needed in order to get going and get the first prototypes developed and also hold them in our hands. And then, yeah, when you introduced us to Torsten, that was, of course, for us sort of the next big step there. We were, of course, also talking to other potential investors there, but he was by far the most interested in geothermal, willing to learn, and you could really see that he was trying to build something. I mean, his VC fund at the time was also relatively small they had just started with it. So there we really saw that we felt like there was something also growing in that sector that we could also benefit from greatly. And so we put a lot of energy in there. There's other angel networks that we were talking to at the time as well. Like there's two bigger angel networks in Switzerland. One is called BAS, Business Angel in Switzerland. The other one is called SICTIC, SICTIC. Both are quite interesting if you're looking to raise funds. Essentially, they have pitching days every once in a while where you can go to, and then whoever is interested within those networks can go and talk to you in more detail and invest eventually in you. But for us, it was not massive amounts of money that we needed at the time. So we wanted to go with smaller amounts of investors but instead have it be very focused on people that could really bring us further. So we really want to have people at that point that wouldn't just bring in money, but would bring in connection or market or both.
Yeah. And you're structuring that fundraise as I know because you told me like with the goal of reaching certain milestones that then are gonna allow you to raise the next round.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, in the end, you're sort of forced to go about it that way, right? You can't get all your funding that you need, especially for hardware, in a single round. You need to somehow essentially build conviction with investors, right? Reduce risks, build conviction for them that it's a viable business case. And you can do that initially with a hardware company by de-risking your technology. And you de-risk it by developing it further, by testing it in more areas and sort of showing results that way. And so for us, that's always natural. It's a bit difficult with our machine specifically, because there's a very natural way of showing that it's working, which is drilling down. And the amount of meters that you have drilled is sort of like you're doing good or you're doing bad. But it's not really like that for us at all. For us, the machine can work super well with us having only drilled 10 or 20 meters, because the first meters are the most difficult ones for us to get through, because you need to stabilize the borehole somehow. And if you go deeper and deeper and deeper afterwards, it doesn't change much anymore, at least until like 300-400 meters. Not much changes there. You're just going down, the water pressure increases a little bit, but you're not validating it further. But that's really difficult to communicate with investors that are not in this industry and don't understand how this works. So you're forced to go on with numbers that are easily understandable. And so having all modules together is one of them, of course. Drilling to a certain depth is one of them. Having a pilot project done is one of them. And these sort of things show, okay, the system is a certain level of reliability, has gained some attractiveness in terms of market, and maybe some first revenues. And then you can go out and get the next investors. And for us, that is also how we're going to be doing it this year. Again, we're likely going to be raising another round towards October, September time, ideally if our milestones are hit this summer. And then we'll be reaching out to our network of VCs again and see who's interested in the end, who wants to get on this journey with us and bring this to market. Afterwards, it's again, there will be raising for specific milestones to be reached, right? A next milestone will be reaching a depth that allows you to install a first heat pump, to have the first couple of pilot projects there, to develop a null series, to set up the ideas for how you want to have your production facility, right? And then you reach those milestones, and then you go to the next round. So you just sort of haggle yourself from one part to the next. And I think that works quite well for you as a startup founder, even though it's not always easy, because you need to, of course, have an understanding of how long or how far away milestones are, and that always changes in startups a little bit. Um, but it means that you also don't need to get overwhelmed with fundraising amounts from the get-go, and you don't need to go into those spheres from straight away. You can sort of work your way up there.
Do you think about the research that you're doing and the progress that you're doing as almost like a stop loss? Like, okay, we've created all this innovation. Even if the next milestone doesn't pan out, we can still sort of exit, given that we've created these patents or these things, or is that like not really in your mind now?
It's difficult to say. So there are certain things, of course, that need to work and work better still for us to monetize them somehow. But there is modules to this drill that we can use in very many applications, and they can also work without the rest of the drill. So there's definitely also avenues where you can pivot a bit. It is certainly not the same as in software, where you're pivoting quite a lot potentially to get to the point where you have a market. Here, I mean, you are developing patents for specific solutions, and you are developing a product essentially for a specific market. But we're developing a drill. It can drill vertically, but who says that it cannot drill horizontally, for example, as well? And then you find other applications. Then you look into cable laying, you look into sewage systems. There are certain types of stabilization drillings that need to be done for tunnels, for foundations, for buildings. So there's lots of different areas where a drill like this could become interesting. Also sub-modules, like for us, the way to support a borehole, which is an extrusion unit, where we essentially feed HDPE filament into a melting chamber that sits inside of this robot. And essentially it creates a pipe around our cells as we go. So that is something that's really useful for geothermal drilling. But it is also very useful for cable laying, because you're literally printing your pipe as you go, and you can repair it in the futures. In case there's a hole in it at some point, you can go through it again, and you can literally just fix the bits where it is no longer waterproof or airproof and so on. So you
Yeah.
definitely have more of a lock in terms of technology than with a software company, but you need to find avenues because it's not always going to play out the way that you think it is.
Yeah, but I think also it's something that a lot of founders are underestimating is that when you go after something hard, you are solving like a series of hard problems along the way. Like that, those solves like can be like a plan B. Like I remember back in the days, there was a presentation from the CTO of Flipboard at the time, I think. And they solved a very hard problem of discovery and like surfacing the more interesting content and so on. And then like, yeah, that company didn't explode, but that technology was very useful. And I think the guy was a brilliant technician and like a brilliant developer. And he had like 2 or 3 of these projects that in the end were sold for the technology. And it was still a great outcome for him and for his early investors. It's not going to be like a blockbuster sort of, tier 1 venture capitalist yet and so on, because it stops before that, but still a good outcome for everybody. So sometimes doing harder things is actually less risky and more beneficial for you as a founder compared to trying to chase something easy that monetizes straight away.
Yeah, I think it also really depends on what you want. I guess like it's as a hardware company, it's more difficult to sort of escape the VC route than with a software company. But you really also need to have an understanding of whether you want to have a venture capital company join your company, right? Like there is a certain trajectory that it requires you to do. A lot of times it also might not be something that is desirable to you, depending on what type of business you're trying to build. But there's many different ways that you can build a startup and many different reasons why you want to build it and how you want to build it. And then you as a founder need to decide which route you want to go down. And yeah, a lot of the news that you always hear is on the amounts of funding raised, which is sort of like that is equivalent to success. But to me, a very successful company is one that doesn't need to raise much money and still managing to grow. Right? That is something great if that is possible. With hardware, it is difficult because oftentimes, unless you've done a successful exit before, you're not going to be able to just afford all the things that come with it, like engineers, like the different parts that you need to manufacture, the time that it just takes for building parts. I think that is something that is underestimated greatly, the whole supply chain that needs to sit behind this. For us to develop a prototype, it just takes months and months and months to do, even after the drawings are done for parts, because you just need to find the right suppliers. You need to find somebody that can deliver not only to a certain price point, but most of the time to a certain time frame. Because if you look at parts manufacturers in Europe, they're very spoiled in the sense of they've been working with the automobile industry for the past, I don't know, 40, 50 years. They have their customers that take up huge quantities of things. They're not interested in having new startups join and maybe order quantities of 10. That is nothing interesting to them. And so they give you lead times of sometimes 3 to 6 months. And if you need to iterate and need to test, then that makes your life impossible to a certain extent, because
Yeah.
you might run out of funding before you can even test one prototype. So it's a choice that needs to be made a little bit with VC funding or not. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that is a success factor to business. I think you can really look at what you're building. You can try and find value in different parts and to what you're building, and you can see where that is applicable. And in hardware, that sometimes also seems like it's maybe less obvious, because you seem like, I'm building a drill, so like how could it be applicable to anything else other than drilling, right? But we're developing a gearbox that fits into very tight spaces. It can be used for other applications. We're developing an extrusion unit, can be used for other applications. So I think it is just, you need to sort of spark your creativity as well and see in what other areas could be interesting as well. And sometimes it's also a bit lucky, right? Like somebody comes to you with an idea and you think, that sort of makes
Yeah.
sense.
The classical example is SpaceX doing internet, right? Like they needed demand
Yeah.
for the rockets, and then they created their own demand for the rockets, right? And regarding the ideas, indeed, right? I was listening to a podcast, I forgot who said it, but that you cannot have more than one good idea every like 2-3 years. if you think you have more good ideas than that, then you're just fooling yourself. And like, yeah, like some ideas need to be very, very good ideas, and they come by like very rarely. But when they do, like, yeah, they can go a long way, right? They can really go a long way.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's super
also
interesting.
there, right?
So
Yeah, some people start off with a really good idea and then they get it going, but other people, they start off with a really bad idea and then meet people who give them ideas again, and then they come up with a super good idea, right? Because you have an understanding of how the market works. It always changes a bit. Sometimes the market is so obvious that it's enough for you to have a good idea, and then you can develop it and the market will accept it. But sometimes you also just need to go to the market with a shitty idea and then have them tell you how bad it is and show you what you should be doing instead. So
yeah, indeed, indeed. Has it happened on your end? Like, I imagine the start was very technical with like the idea of drilling with the drone, and then like maybe the market came a little bit later, or like sort of the beachhead of the heating of houses, or was that the idea from the beginning?
so for us, the idea was drilling from the beginning. It was of course very very technical, but for us, it was always developed together with the market to a certain extent. So we went really early. We went to customers when we were still just maybe a bit further along than ideas. We had some concept. We started exploring that together with customers already. And so they've been on this journey with us for a really long time. Uh, that I think for us is really, probably for most startups, is really important to try and get that out as early as possible and try and get some people that are sort of willing to invest at least their time in finding a solution alongside with you that is required to a certain extent, and then they're willing to also share information with you, share data with you, and then you are starting to build something. If you, otherwise you're just building something on your own. um,
Yeah,
may or may not work,
yeah,
but
and I think there is an amount of like sort of white canvas of like how much you can do when the company is very young, that is extremely overwhelming, and it can, you have all sorts of like pulling vectors that can concentrate that white canvas, right, on like what you want to build, what do you like, what do founders like, and what do employees like, and so on. And that a lot of companies I think
customers
follow
like,
that exactly, right. So the much better vector to follow is normally what would customers want and what are they willing to pay for, and that like clarifies so many questions, and it kind of pulls your company, pulls your business plan, pulls everything together into the right
yeah.
direction. And I mean, we've done this
At
mistake
the
for a long
same
time.
time,
I see a lot of companies that really don't think about that hard enough.
yeah, for sure. At the same time, if you do it that way, you need to have enough customers that also pull you in the same direction, right? If you have one customer pulling you in one direction, you might be building a specific solution for the city of Rotterdam, but it needs to be sort of a mix out of many people's opinions that point towards a certain direction.
Yeah, and like to figure out that problem, but that problem not from like a technical standpoint, not from a artistical standpoint, but from like an actual customer problem, and like people actively looking for a solution. That's true. I do think
Yep.
that the vast majority sort of over indexes on not listening to the customer rather than listening too much to a single customer, right? By and
Yes.
large, every advice needs to be applied to the specific case. Otherwise, it remains very general and very useless.
Yeah,
Super
well,
nice.
it's comfortable, right? To say, oh, I've talked to a couple of customers now, and now I'm building my product. And then you get lost in building a product, and then you do that for 2-3 years, and then you go back to customers, and they've changed, or they're no longer interested in what you're building. So it's like you as somebody who likes to build, and if you're going to be a founder, then you like to build things, no matter what it is, if it's a product, a hardware, or a software, or it is the business itself. So then that is something that you enjoy doing. And then sometimes you forget the part of, oh, somebody still needs to buy this and want this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it clarifies so much. I think another massive phenomenon is this idea of like, I want to be in that business. I think that the other massive mermaid on the beach is that business is easier. That market is easier. Concept is easier. Software, if you're doing hardware, then software is easier. If you're doing software, then hardware is easier, right? In reality, everything is very
Mm.
hard. right? And the only thing that makes it a little, well, there are many things that make it a little bit easier, but like this idea of like constantly thinking about the customer and how to help other people in a better way and build a competitive advantage and help more people in a more meaningful way over time simplifies a lot of those discussions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what some people also underestimate is that you need to like the market, to like the people that you would be dealing with as your customers. And that's not always the case. You might sort of like the product that you're building and you might like the impact that you're having, but you need to also like to work with the people that would be buying the product from you. And for us, that is something like that for me. I mean, in the past, I didn't have much to do with the drilling industry, and it's in the end, it's a construction industry. It's very specific. It's not something that usually you get into contact with very much when you go to do your studies at a university, right? Like it's you're out in the field, you're talking about real problems. It's very much a no bullshit industry, right? And and so you need to like that as well, and you need to like to have conversations with these people, learn from these people as well, that have been in this industry for a long time and know so much more than you.
Yeah. But if you did listen and build something for the customer, if you end up not liking the customer, then what you build still has value and you can probably exit, right? If you build it just because you like it, and then like it's very tough to exit at that point, I feel.
I would agree. Yeah, you can. It's of course difficult to cross certain thresholds if you have trouble speaking with customers.
So maybe changing topic, right? We touched upon Rotterdam. You were here for some years, and then you moved to Switzerland. What do you see as like differences in the sort of startup environment and startup environment in a large sense, right? So like there's the funding environment, obviously, but there is like a talent, there is a talent acquisition sort of discussion. There is definitely like some sort of taxation. There is definitely things on the capital and things on like all of these things make different environments easier or harder for startups to scale in and to scale at, right? So yeah, what do you see as the main differences between these two?
So the thing I have to say that I come in contact the most and which annoys me the most is a different culture and people that are working in Switzerland in comparison to the Netherlands. What I remember from the Netherlands, also from working at Equidam in different startup hubs, is that there is quite a sense of community between the different startups, and you sort of know other people quite well. You know also their skill set quite well. And if you need help in a certain area, you know who to ask. So we had that in Rotterdam in the Science Tower. We had that, but we also had that afterwards in 42, Workspace 42. You just have a community of people where it's relatively tight knit. You hang out with each other, you spend time with each other also after work every once in a while. And that way you have this net of people and contacts surrounding you that can help you. And that is something that so far I've been missing quite a bit in Switzerland. So it's a lot more people are sort of doing their companies, but sort of in their own space. And there's a lot less
Yeah.
communication between those companies, a lot less idea sharing and also problem sharing happening. That is something that I feel is greatly missing here, that I wish there was more of. There's of course events and so on where you can come together, but it's not I'm not talking about these events. I'm talking on the sort of day-to-day business of you work in a startup hub. There's other startups around you, but you don't get to see them very much. That is something that I think is a bit of a shame, because I think that is something where the Netherlands is really strong. When it comes to talent, I think I have a little bit less experience in the Netherlands, but here in Switzerland, what is very nice and very easy at the moment is finding good engineers. So there's a lot of good engineers coming out of ETH, for example, or coming out of the different universities around here. So that is not usually an issue of ours. What is difficult to find is mechanics, for example, because mechanics, there's less and less mechanics. Usually what you're trained to do is you're trained to work in a production line. And so that is also something that you potentially want to do, right? You want to produce on a manufacturing belt. But where we are as a startup is we need to have people that like to test prototypes, that like to assemble, disassemble, understand, see where things are going wrong, and think together with the engineers to solve problems. And then usually the people that are interested to do that, they go on and do their studies in mechanical engineering. So then you have another mechanical engineer who then wants to do
but
like
not a
CAD
mechanic.
work and so on, of course. We're not a mechanic anymore. That is something that we're struggling with and have been struggling with over the past year quite a bit, finding the right people that are really good at what they're doing in the workshop and that bring the passion also for them to help us test. Because I find it sometimes interesting, because for me that is the most exciting part of this entire journey, right? Like I'm doing the boring part in this startup, and doing the part that is sort of supplying with funds that the other people can keep on working. But if you're in the workshop and you have the material in your hands, you assemble them, you test, that's where the actual progress is happening. So that I find is the coolest part at all. Like if I was trained as a mechanic, I think I would love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
it's not easy
it
to
should
find.
be like peak. It should be peak work for a passionate mechanic, and it's harder to find. I saw yesterday a podcast with Jensen Huang of NVIDIA saying that maybe one of the bottlenecks for scaling AI is going to be plumbers, because there's not going to be enough plumbers to plumb up the data centers to then have servers and so on, right? So it seems to be a widespread issue. Plus, I think like a good mechanic that has their own practice right now, they are like earning quite a bit, right? And so then hiring them at a reasonable budget is gonna be tough, right? Taking them away from all that freedom and sort of having their own customers and so on to like work on a specific on a dream almost is gonna be tough. Yeah. Circling back on the network aspect of the Netherlands, first of all, the community around. I think most companies, most governments, most investors are underestimating the importance of it. And if you see historically at obviously Silicon Valley, Bell Labs, and so on, but also like there are cases of, for example, the UK hi-fi industry, right? So like these engineers making speakers, loudspeakers, and turntables and stuff, and UK hi-fi was dominating the whole industry in the 80s. The whole industry was having, I believe, a monthly dinner, and because they were all engineers and they were all like on the same boat, or they thought they were on the same boat, they were sharing things very, very openly, and that was creating the best industry in the world, right? If you think about microchips in Taiwan, and they say now production of microchips is very much an art as well as a science, because you need to know like these quantities, these precise recipes. They're called to make wafers and to have them yield higher yields. So I think people underestimate that. The conjunction, I think, that we had at the time in Rotterdam, where the whole industry was almost starting, like the startup industry in a sense, and it got all crammed into the same place. Everybody was like fairly young, and it was a great community. I don't think it repeated after that in the Netherlands. It will again, like, but it might be a temporal thing, not only like a location thing. Yeah, I was like last month, I was in Station F in Paris, and like yeah, that one seems like a great place as well, right? You bring like so many startups, so much talent, so many corporates in the same place. Something will come out, and it did, right? So yeah, but it's interesting. I thought Switzerland would be easier to connect rather than compared to the Netherlands.
I think the Dutch in general, also maybe due to their history of having a lot of immigration, are very open to new people, and that is the same that is then transferred to the startup world. I mean, it's a shame to hear that it's not no longer how I remember the nice golden times. But yeah, here in it's, and you might have it also differently in certain areas, right? Zurich might be different from Lausanne, which might be different from Winterthur again, in terms of the people, but or the hubs that you have. But in general, I feel like we're working from one of the bigger hubs for startups, and there is definitely a lot of talent. There is a lot of startups that are here, very interesting products, but you don't get to meet the people very often unless you sort of make the genuine effort to go to their door, knock on their door, and ask them, "Hey, what are you guys doing? Tell me a bit more about it." And that I feel like is something that that sets us back a little bit in comparison to places where you have get-togethers, where people really also go to and commit to also spending some time at work after work. That is something that that doesn't happen very much here. People usually they go to work and then they go home afterwards. There's not much sort of oh, I want to connect with other people.
How do you feel like the environment is developing on the funding side? Like, I know, well, you told me, right, it was a bit more dynamic compared to the Netherlands because of these programs, but also I think now the focus on AI is seeing like Zurich very much coming up in Europe as a center for that. And you have, yeah, definitely the universities, but also corporates having their own sort of AI teams in Zurich these days. How's that
Mm.
evolving, do you think?
So I think in terms of funding, you sort of have to exclude AI companies a little bit because they are in their own sort of sphere at the moment with funding amounts that are beyond anything you can imagine. Right? It's there's an insane hype for it, and Zurich is definitely experiencing that right now. As you say, all the major AI companies are here, from Anthropic to Google to all ChatGPT. They're all here and they're all developing here. I think that is for the most part because Switzerland has become sort of a center within Europe, geographically well located, a good standard of living without having all EU laws. I think that is an
Mm,
important factor in here that sort of draws them here.
fair.
But I think funding is always very much dependent on the sector that you're in and whether it's difficult. So climate tech funding has, in my opinion, but you might know that better even, has decreased over the last couple of years. In general, people are sort of investing less in climate tech. There was a boom before that. Geothermal funding specifically is now increasing quite a bit because of also of larger startups like Fervo in the US or Quays that have really sort of shown the way towards a marketable product that you can actually make money with in the US. And now you're seeing a lot of VCs being really interested in geothermal and wanting to learn more. But it is still a very niche industry. So little knowledge that people have on it, especially also when it comes differences in different types of drilling.
Yeah.
It's a difficult market,
Yeah.
I think, to understand for a lot of people. So funding also very much varies, but in general, I feel like there is a lot of money available. There is a lot of different programs that you can also use. There's of course the EU. I was talking to you about it. We tried with the EIC Accelerator. We'll be trying again. We didn't get any funding in the last round with them. It is something. It's a great vehicle to bring funding to startups. It is just. I think it has been made way too complicated. Uh, but I think they're working on it. I think this year might be different already to last year. There is a Sprint in Germany that I'm not sure whether you've come across them, which are quite interesting for startups, to be honest. They're the sort of federal agency for innovation in Germany, and they're now trying to set up sort of likewise entities in different countries. So they're currently doing that in the Netherlands as well. So they're essentially what they're doing is they're very heavily focused on business model. So they want to see that your business model is something that can generate money, and they are supported by VCs in the background that sit in on the decision making. And you would start with they have some calls every once in a while, but you usually start with something called a validation project. So this validation project essentially it doesn't need to be your entire development, but it can be a certain area in what you are developing for your product. And you are essentially, they are ordering this validation from you. And so you have a customer that pays you up to about, I think, 200K for completing this work. There's no deliverable at the end of it besides reports, like 2 reports that you need to do. And then from there, you can jump into higher classes of funding. So they can fund you with a founder's grant of up to €1 million, where 100% of the milestones are covered. And then in the next step, they have funding vehicles where they can invest and they can cover 70% of development, up to 35 million. So it's really big amounts of funding that are available. I think this year there's 300 million euros in the pot that they're trying to spend on interesting startups all over Europe, including Switzerland. So there's definitely funding if you're looking to go for it and find the right things for you, even if specific sectors might be a little bit underserved at the moment.
Yeah. Interesting. So alternatives and indeed. Okay. So on your end is investors that add a lot of value or programs that kind of stay a bit out of your way, right? So I think you're being very strategic about this type of investors. It's a great approach. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In the end, that's sort of what the greatest asset that these funding programs and investors can have, right? They're not going to be able to tell you how to drill. That's our job. That's what we need to develop. That's not the investor that needs to bring in that knowledge. What they can do is they can help you develop your business model further. That can be very valuable. Understanding sort of a bit more like getting to the real world and analyzing discussions as well, and they can get you talked about. And if you're being talked about, then other people are interested in you potentially. And that can be a great asset. And public funding, for me, should be something that has a clear process, of course, that tries and finds things that are very valuable to our future. That they need to have some sort of, they need to have a sense and a purpose. These projects, and that might be struggling to require funding. As you said before, like hardware and software companies are both very difficult to start. In hardware, you usually have the problem that you really require funding, right? And there is certain gaps usually when it comes to funding that public funding should ideally cover. Like you have the angels, and then you have your VC investments, right? And in between there, I call the 600K gap. Nobody's willing to spend 6K. The angels don't have the 600K, and the
That's true.
VCs say, it's too little. Like you have the angels, and then you have your VC investments, right? And in between there, I call the 600K gap. Nobody's willing to spend 6K. The angels don't have the 600K, and the
That's true.
VCs say, it's too little. And that's sort of where the funding programs are really valuable in there. That can jump in there and provide you with the funds that you can continue.
Super nice. Yeah, indeed. Let's talk a second, if we can, about the sort of the technical aspect, right? So you did a couple of CLAs with the earliest investors, and then they got converted. How was that process? Did you manage to find standardized things? Did you have to build a lot of it? Were investors familiar with this type of things? How did that go?
Not so. The thing is, raising a round in general, an equity round, is already quite a lot of work on your end, on the lawyers and on the investors and on their lawyers end. So you already have 4 parties involved in there. And then if you bring in CLAs into the mix, that adds complexity, of course, because you need to have them convert, and then it all needs to be calculated and all needs to be checked. And in our specific case, we started our life as a company as a GmbH, so like the Dutch BV equivalent. And as a GmbH, you have
Swiss
a lot
GmbH.
less Swiss GmbH. Yeah, exactly. You have a lot less requirements to fulfill as an AG. It's easier to found it, so you need to have an initial investment of 20K versus 100K. And I think in the Netherlands, you need a cent or so to start a company. Here, you need quite some money. And when you then transfer from GmbH into an AG, that's quite a lot of work, because you're changing the form of your business. And so you have auditors involved all of a sudden. You need to show that that you're not making crazy losses in your GmbH, which of course is impossible, because, well, you're going to be making losses
You are.
in your company. So you need to do like smart shifting around of CLAs that essentially are being like what the way that it was solved for us in the end was that we could use the CLAs, have them transferred to us as founders, and then us essentially invest the money ourselves into the company. So that way we don't have losses in the company from the get-go. And then in return, we promise to those investors that we will be giving them shares. So it's a whole weird process that takes a lot of time, that costs a lot of money. So if anybody is starting a company in Switzerland and has the funds available, of course, it's also a luxury position, but has the funds available, then do start an AG from the get-go and do not go into GmbH and try and switch afterwards, because yeah, it is a very costly, very time-consuming thing that can make your life very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the beginning, those are meaningful, extremely meaningful amounts, right? It's extremely tough to come up with like 20K, let aside a K. when you're just starting out and so far you've been a student, or you've worked like a few years but you still haven't put that money aside even later. That's a lot of money, right? So not for investors but for, say, normal founders that want to make it on their own money and what they earned so far. Extremely tough. So, and I do think like it's a massive barrier, right? It's the true innovation, or the one that really goes the distance, like at the beginning, it doesn't look like the right idea to back, almost never, right? And so allowing
Yeah.
like more ideas to be tried is normally very beneficial. And I do understand, like in the past, you had to ensure credit worthiness of companies because people were paying with checks and things like that. But now, like the credit worthiness of companies is a lot less useful. People pay in advance on a credit card, on a Stripe form, right? So, and companies also, like if I purchase Gmail, I pay in advance every month, right? So they don't need to worry about my credit worthiness at all. So then this limit of initial investment is completely useless these days. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
As you say, it is a barrier that is unfortunately there, which makes it more difficult to start a company. You can't just simply go out to your notary and start a company. Unfortunately, that is definitely something that is better handled in the Netherlands, right? Where you can literally
Then
go out there with nothing, start your company.
you change the company form now, you have converted the CLAs, everything is clean, everything is easy and cost effective.
Now everything is clean. I wouldn't say everything is easy. It is definitely it is in line now. We have our shareholders agreement in place and have our ESOP in place. All those things are not possible with a GmbH. You can't have investors just like that on your outside investors on a GmbH in Switzerland. So that was a
Yeah.
long process.
So
Very happy that we went through that now. And yeah,
so let's say there is a very similar situation where you have like a couple of researchers in a university in Switzerland. What would be your main advice for them? Not necessarily about the company structure, but just like what you've learned so far that you would like to pass on to them
to researchers at a university. So I guess
that want to start a
not to
company,
play
obviously
into
from their own research.
uh, not to play into stereotypes there, but I think the customer thing is quite an important one, and I think in research that gets forgotten to a certain extent because yeah, your research is sort of the dream of a builder. No, you get funds to build something without needing to have a customer for it, and then afterwards is only when you find out, oh, maybe there is a customer for it, and then you want to put this into a company form. So you're very used to just working your product without checking out the market part. And that is something I think that is non-negotiable. You need to be in close contact with the customers and get their ideas and get their feedback, because the chances that you develop something that perfectly fits them are super low. You need to make adjustments to what you're developing, right? You need to develop it further, and so that you can only do with their feedback. Besides that, I think uh, also just because you are potentially very deep into a certain topic, if you're a mechanical engineer or if you're a biologist, you don't need to that doesn't mean that you need to be the one that continues doing that, right? You can also explore the market. You can also talk to customers. You don't need to have a business person necessarily or a finance person there for you that does that for you. Sure, they're more used to it, but maybe you are as well. Maybe you enjoy that as well. So I think it's not like just because then you might go to an investor and the investor just sees, oh, that's your CV, so you're a researcher and you're not, you don't come from the sales point background. It doesn't mean that you are not the right fit to do that. And it's always going to be you understanding this product best and potentially also understanding the customers best. So I think just don't be discouraged in that way that you put yourself in a certain corner just because of your education in the end. I think that is something in general for anybody, right? I studied finance as well, and I do still do some finance things for the company, like fundraising, of course, and when looking at budgeting and forecasting. But I do a lot of other things as well that I didn't study, and all you need to have in the end is interest. You need to have interest to learn, and if you have that, then
Yeah,
you can
curiosity.
do
Yeah.
things, right? Unless it's like Yeah, your curiosity. There's a lot of things that are sort of easy pickings. You don't have to come from business, of course, and become a rocket scientist without training. That's not necessarily the case I'm referring to. But in startups, there's so many things that need to be done that anybody can do, really, as long as they have curiosity for it. And I think that's the great part about working in a small company, that you get to learn so much. And that's something that, I mean, I experienced in Equidom the first time, where you're doing different things that you're not trained to do, and you're learning every day. And that's the reason why I'm doing startups in the end as well. I want to learn more.
Awesome. I think on that note, we close this episode. Thanks for everyone listening, and talk to you next time. And thanks for Moritz for coming and sharing everything so openly. So very grateful for that.
Thank you very much, Dana. Very cool to be here.